Hello, my name is Daniel Trujillo. I am a student in COH100, Introduction to Health Consumerism. And in this video, we are going to be going over the history timeline of U.S. healthcare starting in the 1900s and ending in 2000s. Starting in the 1900s, we had the development of the American Medical Association, and which solidified itself as a national force at this time. And that also led to an increase in physicians over that 10-year period from about 8,000 to 70,000 by the end of that year, by the end of those 10 years. And there was also, doctors weren't really expected to provide free services to the public anymore, since it was a more refined profession at this time, or was beginning to become a more refined profession. And then starting in the 1910, we had hospitals kind of raised their own standards of what it meant to run a hospital. This included things like cleanliness standards and becoming more organized and just refined as a whole in general, just trying to optimize their function. And the use of medications also began during this time, things such as pain relief medications, but there were a lot less than there are in the current age, for sure. And progressive reformers at this time wanted to push for healthcare, but beginning of the war at this time really undermined those efforts and shifted the attention away from those reforms, and so it never necessarily got around during this time period. And then going into the 1920s, these same reformers were trying to emphasize the growing cost of medical care as an argument to reform it and improve it even more. And there was also higher physician pay during this time, since it was a career more in demand and constantly developing. And also during this time, penicillin was discovered, fun fact, but it was not put into use to counter pain or infection until 20 years down the line. And in the 1930s, Social Security Act is passed, and private insurance is offered by the Blue Cross, which is one of the first companies to really set their own private insurance. And there were plenty more that followed later in the years, as we know, but it was one of the leading ones across multiple states. The 1940s came around. We were around World War II during this time, and companies began offering health benefits to convince people to work there at different jobs rather than increase pay, so that they could focus that money towards war efforts. And then President Truman and Roosevelt both tried to at some point create some kind of healthcare reform, but both of those efforts really didn't go anywhere during their presidencies. And then over the 1950s, post-war effects and communist fears also kind of distracted the public and businesses from healthcare and improving it. There was a whole fear of, I believe it was called the Red Scare, where people were worried about Korean communist beliefs, and other related countries were bringing those ideas into the U.S., and people were really scared of that during that time period for some reason. And private insurance also developed for those who could afford it during this time, as well as welfare for people with lower incomes who couldn't afford their own privatized healthcare. And in the 1960s, nearly 700 insurance companies begun to sell insurance. So there was a lot of market for insurance companies, and whether they were private or public ones for lower income families, there was a lot of competition for who would be one of the bigger healthcare insurance companies. And yeah, so going into the 1970s now, we saw healthcare costs they were rising a lot. So they were, compared to inflation rates, healthcare costs were rising much faster. And this was mainly due to hospital developments. Hospitals are always improving their medicine and function. So with that came lots of increased costs in medicine, technologies, and hospital sizes themselves to hold more people and take care of multiple people at once. And things like percentages of women in the healthcare field also went up a lot during this time. I believe it went from about 9% to 25% during this 10-year period. And going into the 1980s, we had a shift towards privatization of healthcare and corporatization of healthcare. So that means corporations were coming in and beginning to join into these hospitals to make their own money off of it, however that may be. It was previously a decentralized structure, but very quickly it became a corporate push for sure. And insurance companies also began to complain about the fee-for-service model that they had once adopted, where and they would only pay after each specific service, but they felt like it was being exploited and weren't really trying to stay with that model anymore. And they instead wanted to push more towards capitation payments, which is known as a payment you would make, however that may be, monthly or yearly, depending on your plans, and you would pay that set amount each month, and you were able to go to the doctor or get treatment for something consistently as you'd like for a set price, which they found to be more stable and less exploited than the fee-for-service model. And in the 1990s, healthcare rose at about twice the rate of inflation, which is very, very fast. And it was becoming very costly, and it led to an increase in the amount of people who had no healthcare service provider at all. And in the beginning, in the earlier years, about like the 30s or 40s, there was only about 18 million people who would say they had no healthcare provider whatsoever. But now that we're in the 80s or 90s, I mean, that rose to 44 million, which is just over double the amount, which was beginning to be concerning to American citizens and politicians who had a stake in these kind of things. Now going into the 2000s, Medicare as a whole was starting to be viewed as worse. Many people were using it and not putting a lot back in, as people would like to say, and at the same time, direct-to-consumer advertising, such as like medicine commercials you'd see or some kind of medical device like blood pumps or blood sugar trackers and things like that. Things like that were being promoted much more during this time. And we see that costs of healthcare and people without insurances steadily been rising over during the 2000s for sure. So there definitely has been some improvements and some downsides to it. But yep, that's it for the 1900s to 2000s healthcare U.S. timeline. Thanks.